Welcome, everyone. I'm Ashish Kaushal, CEO of diversity staffing firm Higher Talent and the founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build belonging in the workplace. Consciously Unbiased is all about amplifying the voices of impact makers and tapping into the power of the community to make real change happen. Today's topic is very special to me. Today's topic is about men as allies. We have a majority of the male panel today because I believe we have to stop talking about how to fix women. They don't need to be fixed. The systems do, and we have to talk about how many men show up in the workplace. After all, the majority of leadership positions are still held by men, so engaging more men is essential for advancing equality. We have some amazing leaders here to share the topics, to share what they've learned and how they can support women in the workplace. We have special guest Henry Rowling. He's the founder of Flying Cars Innovation. Welcome, Henry.
Hi there, welcome.
Brad Johnson, professor of psychology for the U.S. Naval Academy and co-author of Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
And then we have David Smith, associate professor of Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins University, and also co-author of Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace.
Thanks for including me.
Absolutely. And then Purvis Taylor, mental health advocate, life coach, wellness practitioner, author, and also a previous host in our Breaking the Bias podcast, if you guys are interested in checking that out later. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And then Hira Ali, CEO of Advancing Your Potential and author of Her Allies, a practical toolkit to help men lead through advocacy, as well as author of Her Way to the Top, a guide to smashing the glass ceiling. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'd love to start off with asking each of you how to tell us who you are in more detail and what you do and why the issue of men as allies is personally important to you. Hira, do you want to start?
Right, yes. Right, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm privileged to be the only woman on the table, in this table right now, but I think it's a welcoming change to have more men talk about gender equality than women. So as already introduced, I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Advancing Your Potential. I'm also the author of 2 books, Her Way to the Top and Her Allies. And I'm very passionate about gender equality, racial equality, and all forms of equality. And I talk a lot about and write a lot about allyship and women in leadership and racially diverse leadership. And I'm also recently started proudly owning the title of an activist because I talk and speak about things that I care about.
I love that. Me. And we'll go back to that later because I want to know the difference between an ally and an advocate or an activist. And so we'll definitely talk about that later on. Purvis, you're next.
Well, I think to add on to what you already shared, I am the co-founder of Alchemic Solutions, which is a program that's based here in New York City that teaches young men of color how to develop and cultivate emotional intelligence. And I think as it relates to gender equality, I think awareness is the beginning of everything. If we can teach ourselves to be aware of ourselves, then we can progress to being aware of other issues that are plaguing others. So I think that's my contribution.
Absolutely. Welcome. And Henry?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm co-founder of Flying Cars Innovation. So we develop new marketing campaigns for startups and NGOs and brands that do good in the world. I'm someone, essentially, the reason I'm interested in this as a topic is I'm someone that's come from a privileged background. So I'm a white man from a middle-class family. And I see lots of other people who are facing kind of far greater barriers than I've had to face in my life, and just want to use my platform to do something about that. So in my sort of career, I've worked at charities that support disabled people, homeless people, refugees, and in general, I don't see men doing enough to further the cause of women's equality. So I want to use the platform that I've built from the privilege I've had to do something about that.
I love it. And David, welcome as well.
Hello, thanks, and it's great to be here with everybody. So, I guess in addition, it would be helpful. I'm a sociologist, and I do all of my research in the area of gender, work, and family. So, thinking about gender perspectives on careers in the workplace and how family intersects with that. And, I think one of the things that, as Brad and I started collaborating together and doing this work, we noticed very early on were that these are often framed, these gender inequities are framed as women's issues, and women, so the solutions are often, from organizational perspectives, are often focused on women and fixing women, and not about the broader culture, the broader structure, and men, and how we can be part of the solution. So we love to reframe this as a leadership issue, where we as men and women have a role and a function, a responsibility to be engaged in creating the kind of workplaces where we all want to work and thrive there. But I think also the personal connection, I think, is really important too, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some, maybe why these are things that are personally important to us as well.
Absolutely. And Brad, I'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, my why. I am somebody, I'm a clinical psychologist who has spent his entire career researching mentoring relationships. And I, in all of that time, have seen the data. So part of it is scientific for me. I've seen the data showing that women just don't get the same level of mentoring. And even when they do, they often don't get sponsored. They don't get advocacy as part of their relationship the way that majority men do, very naturally. So there's that kind of nerdly scientific part of me that got me into this work. But then there's the personal, like Dave, there are women that I care about, maybe most notably my sister, who's a Navy captain, very senior officer in the Navy. I talk to her frequently about things that happened to her in the workplace because she's a woman that have never happened to me, even though we're very similar in our leadership style. And I attribute some of my awareness and empathy, honestly, to my sister's willingness to share some of her experience.
Yeah, and I think that's important. It's a lot of times change happens because you connect the mind and the heart, and it affects you or somebody you love. And if you focus on that, then you really make it resonate. Make it personal. What does allyship mean to you? So can we start off with you, Brad?
Yeah. So, I'm going to just put it in three big buckets, maybe in 1 minute here. And this just comes from all the research Dave and I have done. That, for me, it is the interpersonal. It's how I show up in my relationships and hold myself accountable. And if we're talking about gender, how about just starting with learning how to listen more effectively? Apparently, we men struggle with that. Then there's the public side, right? Really putting myself out there, more skin in the game now. It's not just holding myself accountable. I have to hold others accountable, and especially other men. Got to be willing to call things out. How about loudly advocating, for women? So there's that public piece. And the last bucket is really the systemic. This is harder even yet. Now I get to hold my own organization accountable and society accountable. I need to advocate. Someone mentioned advocacy here already, and boy, I got to become an advocate and ask questions about how my organization is missing it or getting it wrong, and how we need to improve so that this is a workplace that everyone can really show up and be authentic. So those are, for me, those are kind of the big three areas I like to focus on.
I love that. And those are manageable. Like if you break it into that, then it's more manageable than vague. So I love that. And David?
Yeah, just to build on, I think what Brad brought up there is, I think the language is important too, and remembering that, allyship is not about rescuing. This is not doing things for somebody. This is doing things with, right? So we need to learn to come alongside and think about, how do we do this collaboratively? How do we show up as partners in the workplace and do this together? And again, because I think we have as much to gain and to learn as men as do women in the workplace, and we can do that for all of us together. The other thing, I think the really important aspect to remember, just from a societal perspective, is that if we're ever going to get to gender equity in the workplace, and being a great ally in the workplace is one place to start, but we also have to remember we have to do this at home. And that, again, for those of us who are partnered with women, we know that women have historically done, up to 2 to 3 times as much of the domestic labor or unpaid labor in the at home. The pandemic has certainly exacerbated that. And if, most of us tend to be in dual earner, dual career couples. And if we're going to survive, we've got to be supportive of our partner's career and do our fair share as allies at home and doing the caregiving and all of that. So I think, again, showing up as allies means being good collaborators, good partners, and that partnership can start at home.
I love that. And, one of the things that really resonated there was allyship isn't a favor, it's a strategic advantage. Right.
Correct.
Henry?
So some really good points already made. I think for me, allyship is around using the kind of power and network, using your brain, your influence, essentially to advance women's equality in practical ways whenever you can. So for me, the practicality of what you do is really, really important. So theory is very important as well. But for me, it's kind of how you show up when you're caught off guard or there's a situation that arises really quickly. So thinking about my own personal experiences of working in offices, from time to time, people say things and I haven't always been able to react in that moment in the way that I would have liked to, looking back retrospectively. So for me, what's really important is, as being an ally, is to think about when you haven't done as you would have liked to have done and try to do better each time. So when you've fallen down or not kind of represented yourself as well as you can do, then trying to sort of be better each time. But I'm all about those kind of practical ways that you can sort of, support.
Yeah. And then you brought up a really good point about self-reflection, because a lot of times we'll be embarrassed that we did something that wasn't kosher and then kind of sweep it under the rug rather than actually reflecting and fixing it in the future, Purvis?
Wow, you guys have provided some great answers. I don't know what to say. No, but you guys have really provided some great, insightful answers. I think if I can add anything, I would say, allyship for me is being intentional and active. Being an ally on purpose, right? And really utilizing my voice. So like in those instances, those moments where, say, for instance, a women counterpart of mine, organization wanted to hire me, but I wasn't available. And I recommended my friend. And I said, pay her what you're going to pay me, or if her quote is higher than mine, pay her that. So like being active and utilizing my voice when necessary, and doing it on purpose because she deserves that. And so like it's for me, it's just the intentionality behind it all.
I love that. And it has results as well, right? So you have to make sure that it's having an impact. It's not just spoken about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So I realized I didn't add my personal whys. The reason why I'm going to begin with that, the reason why I decided to write this book was because having worked in different countries and with different people in different cultures, I'd seen a specific trend holding women back, and not just in women, also in men. I would see that many of them were well-intentioned and they wanted to do something good in this space, but they often didn't know what to do or how to do it. And I decided that, this is it. I'm going to write a toolkit for men. I don't know what I was thinking, telling men what to do. But yeah, that's what I decided to do. And that's the reason why I wanted to write a book in which men, despite whatever level they're at, they can actually take small steps, small actions. They don't have to be major influencers. They can just take, tiny steps in order to support women in their circle. And for me, allyship is people who can choose to challenge themselves first, because it all begins with them, with you, right? Change begins with you. And then they can move on to challenge others, because that's really, really important, specifically when we're talking about male allies. Calling out others is, I think, the most important part for me. And then challenging the organization culture, and finally challenging the organization institution. So I think these were the 4 parts, which I see, that's how my book is also being divided into 4 parts. Allies that can challenge themselves, challenge others, challenge organization culture, and then finally challenge the institution. But yes, as David said, they are not to be saviors. We don't want to be saved. We don't want to be rescued. We need people who are, working collaboratively with us, alongside us, who are mentors, sponsors, advocates, but not saviors.
I love that you wrote a book on it, because I do think change can be overwhelming. And by breaking it down to small steps, sometimes that really helps us. Right, the intention might be there, but then we're not sure where to start. And so I think that's amazing. I'm going to give you another question. So achieving gender equality will only be successful when we all realize it's all of our fight. It's not just a women's issue. How can we bring more men together to tap into the power of the collective? So what's one step from your book, basically?
Oh, having these conversations, inviting men to take part in these conversations, and I think also making them comfortable, telling them that it's all right to make mistakes. It's not all right to not acknowledge responsibility. Of course, you will make mistakes. I think you can't really escape that. But if you do make mistakes, know when to acknowledge your responsibility, apologize, and show genuine intention. And then I think that is my whole focus, is to get people and find out what is it that's holding them back, because I usually start my talks by asking men what is holding them back, so finding their viewpoint and then trying to address it. As a woman, I think we both need to come halfway in order to achieve gender equality. So I think that's important, having more and more conversations.
I love it. Anyone else like to add to that?
I would add that I think one big hurdle sometimes for men, us men, it can be zero-sum thinking too, especially if this is new for me, that, hey, if we men lose or include more women, somehow we're losing opportunity that belong to us, or we're losing positions that belong to us, so there can be this kind of erroneous thinking that for women to share more equally in the workplace, men have got to sacrifice and lose. And I think what those men miss is all of the research data showing that actually when you include more women, and especially include more women in genuine leadership positions, your company does better, your organization thrives, and actually there's more opportunity for everybody, right? The bottom line increases, there are more positions, more opportunity. So the growth mindset versus the zero-sum thinking, I think we can lose sight of that, and we can feel defensive in a way that can undermine the ally behavior.
Absolutely. I was actually going to say that. I was going to say more akin to dominance is akin to lack as opposed to abundance. And I think for a lot of men in those positions, they think that there's not enough room for everyone. And so that scarcity mindset,
Yes.
as he so eloquently stated, that has contributed to why we can't expand beyond that. And so when she really, it's really a mindset. It's really teaching them that dominance is not the way. And so it's really about mindset.
Absolutely. And diversity of thought, honestly, is a strategic advantage, and groupthink is a way to sort of make your business less relevant. So I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I think one of the other aspects, Purvis, you were touching on this, that we don't always understand, to shift that mindset, understand the benefits, right? That there's actually something in this for everybody. Everybody wins when we do this really well. And so we see, one of the ways to overcome some of the reluctance to engage or to be the kind of allies that we're looking for, active and really in doing the work, is we don't have the kinds of relationships with people who are different from us, right? So that we become better allies through understanding people's experiences. We develop empathy and really have our eyes open to what's going on around us. And often that's part of what gets in touch with that, back to that sense of personal motivation to do the work, right? To be a better ally is understanding, again, people who have been around you that are important to you, how they've experienced things in a way that is not just, it's not fair. And then again, most of us have that sense of fairness or justice to get involved and to do the work. And, but I think there's also as we begin to understand the benefits for not only our organization, but for ourselves as men, that we become better leaders. And it's through the kinds of relationships that we're having and the work that we're doing there that begins to expand this pie. And that's how we get past that zero-sum thinking.
Absolutely. Henry, you wrote an article or a post on LinkedIn on how to be a better ally to women, and it got thousands of reactions. Any advice on how male leaders can find their real voice around allyship and social media and inspire other men to do the same thing?
Yeah, it was a really interesting process to go through. So I just wrote the LinkedIn post and wasn't really expecting it. You know, I own a business, so I write content quite regularly, and it normally just does okay, but it doesn't go sort of viral. And this really did kind of go viral. It seemed to really resonate with people, and I think one of the reasons for that was the sort of scarcity of men talking about this kind of stuff online and social media. So I think kind of in the digital space, there's a kind of blurring between work, politics, personal brand building. It all gets quite messy for people, and they don't really kind of know how to react to that, other than sometimes hiding behind sort of corporate statements around diversity. And if people actually use their authentic voice to talk about these issues, it really resonates and cuts through. So I think thinking about the sort of digital space and finding your authentic voice and what you can say about a particular issue, there is a kind of fear that men have around saying the wrong thing and kind of getting a pile on, and people kind of, you know, cancelling them and feeling really kind of scared about saying what they really feel around this. So I think the way that, so, you know, I don't see a lot of CEOs making particularly interesting statements around racial issues or disability issues or women's issues. They're very much kind of hiding behind a corporate cloak, and I feel like that's kind of one of the problems that stops an honest conversation about lots of things. So I think thinking about what your authentic voice is that you can add to a conversation is you really kind of need to think about when you learn the most about a particular issue. So you might revert to when something went well, but actually I think the best time to reflect on when you learn the most is when something's failed or when you've fallen down in a particular scenario, and being honest with yourself. So I think for digital spaces, if you've got something to say, you need to say it with that authenticity. So in the US, the gender pay gap is like 80%. So I think women get paid 80% of what men get paid, and it's something pretty similar for the UK. And if that angers you, which it should do, and I think most people, it would anger most people, then you really need to say that. Don't hide behind sort of corporate statements that you wheel out once a year for International Women's Day, which I think a lot of CEOs do. You need to say practically what you're going to do to fight against that 20% of free work, essentially, that you're expecting all of your female employees to do. And that's really important. And that is how you can kind of find your voice online, is to speak with passion and honesty, and talk about when you failed and how you can get better. So in my sort of working career, when I worked at businesses and organizations, I did quite a lot of hiring, and I didn't get all of those decisions right. And sometimes I made decisions that were based on my bias, and sometimes it was because of conflict avoidance or trying to get out of the situation that was difficult in terms of structural issues. I didn't get everything right. I try, harder each day to be better, and that's my authentic position. It's not to kind of go online and say, hey, I'm great, I've done everything great all the time, because that's not realistic. Yeah. But then, social media encourages us to put our best foot, the best things. You put your best picture on Instagram, you put your best memories on Facebook. That's not a true reflection of who we are.
Yeah, and I think we also need to sort of reward, and what you did was basically authentic. You combined authenticity with strength and vulnerability, right? And putting yourself out there. And I think that was really what resonated and helped. And I think that's something that we normally haven't rewarded men for, is being vulnerable. And that's been shown as a weakness. And I think that's not a weakness. It's actually a strength. And it gets people to go to war for you,
Yeah.
Here, what is the most important first step men can take to advocate for women that you learned when you wrote Her Allies, a practical toolkit to help men through advocacy? And to add to that, can you tell us the difference between advocacy and allyship?
Gosh, where do I start? There's so many steps, but of course the first step would be to challenge yourself. And I think the very first thing when you're challenging yourself is to educate yourself, because you can't change what you're not aware of. So I think it's important to not only do your research and read about it, but also go and expand your social circle and meet with people who are not like you. Because I can't believe the number of times I've had to tell men that just because women in your circle haven't vented out to you, haven't shared a grievance, or it hasn't happened to them, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It still exists. It exists with other groups of women, which you probably are not aware of. So I think expand your social circle. And also when you're educating yourself, I think it's important to look at challenges impacting women through an intersectional lens, because sometimes women can experience marginalization because of the multiple identities they own. So not stereotyping, not generalizing or assuming that just because she's a woman of color, so her experience is going to be very similar to another woman of color, which is not true. Because as an Asian, brown, Muslim woman, my experience might be very different from a Black woman. So every experience is valid. Every experience is unique. You can't cluster, you can't generalize, you can't dilute the challenges of one group and say that, this is what all women are experiencing. So I think it's important to look at it from an intersectional lens, be it gender identity, be it sexuality, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, race, faith. So that's important. And allyship and advocacy. Well, you got me there, because I'm just thinking, what is the difference between allyship and advocacy? But I think allyship is, from what I can see, allyship, you can be like a silent ally. You don't have to, in your own capacity, you can be an ally, and you can whether it's at home, whether it's with your friends, whether it's in your organization, you can be an ally in your own little area. But when you start advocating for it, when you start speaking out, when you start championing it, and you start talking about it, tweeting about it, sharing articles, writing, like Henry's written this post about it. So I think that's when allies become advocates, because they're not only silently being allies to women in their circle, but they're also actively advocating about it. So I think that's how I feel what the difference is. But I think over to the rest of the people.
Yeah, Dr. Johnson, do you have any thoughts around that? I know you talked about this in the past too.
I love the way Hero's talking about this, and it's funny. I haven't heard so much about advocacy separate. I realize you can do that, though. Hearing Hero say that has been helpful for me. I could be an advocate without doing any other ally stuff, and I think there's some real truth there. Yeah. I think when Dave and I are having conversations with men, we sort of put this all on a continuum, right? And we want to be so inclusive. We want to invite men in, recognizing that they're somewhere on the continuum. There are men, let's be honest, who are apathetic. And we don't encounter that many of those guys, right? I just don't really even care about gender equity or diversity. It doesn't even register as significant. I find very few men are apathetic about this. But there are men who are, maybe just sticking their big toe in the water. And yeah, I realize there are some inequities. I'm trying to understand this. I have some awareness, but I'm really not sure what to do. And then you move a little farther on that continuum, and there are men who are a lot more active, right? These guys may call some things out in meetings when there's bias or sexism. These are men who are more deliberately and publicly mentoring and sponsoring women. So there are men on that kind of active phase of the continuum. And then you move to the far end, opposite of apathetic. And I think you start getting to advocacy, again, under this big umbrella, maybe of allyship. And those are the gentlemen who tend to really be leading on this. They lend their voice. You heard Henry is writing about this, online. So he's being more of an advocate. He's putting himself out there, I think, and also willing to put skin in the game when it comes to joining causes or lending my political capital and privilege to causes that I really value and that are important, that promote this. But I think to Hero's point, I'm convinced that you could do the advocacy piece without, necessarily being an ally in other ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. Anyone else have thoughts around that?
I think one of the challenges here also, just to kind of call out maybe one of the elephants in the room, is that I think around allyship, we've seen the faux, fake, or performative allyship
Yes.
is one of the challenges that, when we see people being true advocates and co-conspirators, they're really living it, right? They're doing it, 24/7 every day, and we know that. Whereas performative allyship can be done by choice, right? When you want to do it, or when it's advantageous for you to do it, when it makes you look good, and it's really often very, it's just very cursory, and it can sound like a lot of nice talk, and there's really not a lot of action, and you're really probably not putting any skin in the game. And I think that was one of the things that, when Brad and I were doing some of the interviews with men for our book, Good Guys, that a lot of men talked about how they really felt like, when they were really being that advocate, that's when they were really putting some skin in the game. They felt a sense of maybe personal risk or professional risk. They felt vulnerable in those situations, and it's really interesting to see when we can kind of sense that and feel that I'm really uncomfortable. I'm in a place where I'm uncomfortable, and then just getting okay. It's okay to be in this space, right? This is something I've got to learn to become more comfortable with, and doing that work and overcoming some of the things, the signals and the perceptions around us that we're worried about.
No, absolutely. And speaking of that, do you think we need to value and reward men for non-traditional behavior, such as being collaborative, and how this might help advance equality for all? Should we change the word masculinity to maybe leveraging your strengths for progress to get more men aboard?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because, one of the challenges here is that we don't want to reinforce, what we call the pedestal effect of, so when men do something right, and they get put up on a pedestal for doing what they should be doing. And I completely agree with that. The challenge is that, just calling out negative behavior, right, all the time, it doesn't always lead to the kind of results that we're looking for. So sometimes having some positive reinforcement, we know works really well. And so finding ways that, because sometimes I think as leaders, we're often doing things that we go, well, that's just who I am as a leader. It's the right thing to do for my people. And we don't necessarily understand the impact of it. We do it because it is the right thing. It's just who I am and who I am as a leader. But sometimes having one of our close colleagues or maybe one of our subordinates tell us that, hey, today when you did that, it really meant a lot to me, and here's why. And it's like, oh, wow, I had no idea the impact I was having. And so sometimes sharing some of that that reinforcing aspect, I think, is really helpful. But to your point about should we change, right? Should we change how we talk about masculinity or more traditional masculine behaviors? And I think absolutely. I think a lot of things as leaders, if we just keep it in a leadership perspective, a lot of things as leaders that we did or maybe were trained or socialized to do from a 20th century perspective are just not working in this 21st century, and they're not valued. And we know the research shows us that that's the case, and that we're losing, right? We're losing, as leaders, we're not as effective as we can be. You're not encouraging the right kind of performance. We're not attracting the right kind of talent in our organization. So it's just suboptimal. And I think the sooner we can get to more men understanding that, what's really valued and what's really making a difference, then that's what's going to change the workplace.
Absolutely.
And if I can add a woman's perspective to this, when you're talking about appreciating men for being allies, I know there are a lot of controversial opinions on this, but I personally believe that because there's such few men doing it, I think you do need to recognize. I mean, I do. I always make them, I make videos. I put David and Brad in videos. I celebrate them. I celebrate the men in my life, my husband, my father, my brother, who I think it's important to recognize these efforts. Yes, this should be normalized. But because I think not many people are doing it, I think if we acknowledge it and recognize it and appreciate it, encourage it, we'll have more role models and we'll have more people doing it. So I personally believe that, yes, you should recognize those who are standing up as allies.
Great points. Dr. Johnson, what role do men play in gender equality in that movement? And then what's your response to be a man who argues this is versus sexism? Why do we sometimes see defensiveness around this topic?
Wow. Well, I can probably streamline my answer because my main thought about that, Ashish, is back to zero sum thinking. When I hear the reverse sexism comment, I have to equate that in my own mind with defensiveness. That hey, this is not fair to me. I'm going to lose. It can reflect a fundamental sense of defensiveness. And, beyond the zero sum thinking, just missing all of the information about how we all thrive when we're more inclusive and we have more diversity and creativity on our teams. There's also an issue of privilege here. And I think you got to have Dave and I have taken to calling this the P word because men find privilege so aversive, when you bring that up. But you got to talk about the P word, right? And the irony here is that when I, as a majority cisgender white male, call things out, advocate for fairness and inclusion, on average, I take a bump up, right, in my annual evaluations because I'm a gender champion. Wow, look at that guy. Look how terrific he is. When a woman does exactly the same thing, or any other minoritized group, on aggregate, they're going to take a hit, right? Because they're just pursuing their own best interests, or they're abrasive, or you name it.
Yeah.
It's only when I really understand what Dave and I have taken to calling this, invisible backpack of privilege that I've been carrying around my whole life as a white male. I have not been aware, honestly, of the tailwinds I've had my whole life. Once I recognize I have this backpack and all this opportunity, then I get to actually use it. I get to start sharing it. I get to actually start changing the workplace. It can be a really powerful thing to become aware of my privilege. And especially when I'm aware that, hey, I'm not losing when I use this because my backpack constantly refills. As a white man, it never gets depleted.
Yep.
Once I have that kind of, epiphany taken to heart, I think I become really empowered to begin sharing that. And I think that's what can change men's attitudes and their behavior. But that getting to that awareness, I think, is a challenge.
No, absolutely. And so do you think maybe our assumptions are wrong? Like we're assuming that power is finite. And so for me to get something, you have to lose it. And then the second thing is, there's probably a factor of guilt if I acknowledge that I had some sort of advantage, then you're taking away from my progress or whatever I've earned.
I think that's a big part of the defensiveness around privilege. Yes, whenever you bring up privilege, and it doesn't matter whether it's around gender or race or any other group, there's this immediate defensiveness that, hey, I worked hard, to get where I am. And I think, message back about that is, of course, you worked hard, but so did everybody else. And you just haven't had these constant headwinds. You haven't been aware of it because you've had the backpack and the tailwinds. It's only when I really grasp that. We are not diminishing you or your hard work. We're just pointing out your experience has been quite different and you just haven't been aware of that. So I think it's having, that kind of humble authenticity and maybe flash of insight that really begins to change hearts and behavior.
Yeah. And I don't think it takes away from capability. Like reality is I may have an old boys network and I got somewhere because that gave me a little bit of advantage, but if I wasn't capable, I still couldn't get there, but it did give me an advantage. And so we have to recognize that. Purvis, you wrote an article, as a Black man, I understand Will Smith's reaction, but that wasn't the way. Can you share your thoughts on men's roles as a protector of women and what you think is a better way forward?
Yes. So firstly, I was so grateful that the Griot reached out to me to write that piece. They wanted to get my opinion because I'd worked with them before and they knew that I was probably going to offer a completely different perspective than the other op-ed pieces that were out there. And, in writing it, I was thinking about, because, Will Smith kept saying that he wanted to protect Black women. And I was thinking around the word protection. And when we think about it, at the core of it, we're talking safety, right? Protecting someone from harm. And in one respect, physical harm, there is a need for protection in that sense. But when you expand it, there's also safety of one's dignity, of one's pride, of one's humanity. And I think about that in terms of protecting women. Like, it's not necessarily this rescuing, right, which we've already covered, because no one's a savior. But I think it's about making sure that someone's dignity is still intact. And the way that we affirm one's dignity is to make sure that they get the same rights and privileges that we get, right? And so when I think about it, I teach men emotional intelligence, and at the core of it is the foundation of it is self-awareness. And then we get to self-management, then we get to social awareness, then we get to relationship management. Even within, Brad, to your point, even within your privilege, you've experienced some injustice, right? And if you can tap into that injustice and recognize that there are people who experience that injustice you've experienced all the time, right? We can cultivate that empathy, right? And then once we get to the social awareness aspect, that's where we develop compassion. Compassion is action. That's how we manage the relationship, is through compassion. And one of the things I always say is that a person who is committed to their healing journey, so to be emotionally intelligent means that you have to be introspective and reflect over your life and think about your choices and how you've shown up to now, right? And think about your fragilities, your frailties, your traumas, all those things, right? So when you're thinking about your healing journey, any person who is committed to being on a healing journey, it would hurt them to see someone else in pain or in flux, right? So healed people heal people, right? And so we have to teach men. One of the things I try to teach men is to be committed to your healing journey. That's why I wrote the book, Heal Forward. Heal with the future in mind, but you can only heal if you're helping others to heal as well. So we have to get men to be committed and intentional on their healing journeys.
I love that perspective.
Yep.
Anyone else add to that?
I think Purvis said it all. Oh, go ahead, Hera.
Sorry, Brad, you go ahead.
No. Yeah.
I think, as a person belonging to a racially diverse group and who ticks many boxes, I think what Purvis said, it really hit the nail. You really do need to heal yourself, because a lot of us are carrying past trauma of injustices and, the way they've been treated, and discrimination and interpersonal prejudice, and all these things has affected us. And there's a thing known as acculturative stress, which I've recently been talking about, which a lot of people don't know, but people from racially diverse groups, marginalized groups, even women, because they have been diminished and trivialized and debased in such a long time, they have an acculturative stress where they have to adapt to the values of a dominant group. For example, if I'm the only woman in the room or the only woman of color. And that is a lot of stress. That's a lot of anxiety. And if you put in actual lived experiences in that, then that can really create havoc in a person's life. So I think what Purvis says is, I completely relate to that. It's important for you to heal, because if you're not healing, then you will be reacting at everything. But when you are healed, then you'll be able to, and you heal by helping others and reaching out to others. So I think, yes, that definitely resonated.
Yeah. I was also thinking, like, do you guys see the Oprah interview with him prior to the event? Right. It's almost like he was trying to fix his trauma of not being able to protect his mom by instilling more trauma, and that doesn't really justify like the response, because then we never get out of this cycle,
Yeah. And that's why it's so important for us to heal and be committed and intentional about it. Men in particular, is because that's my, what I specialize in. We don't have a lot of times we're not introspective. We don't have the language, and we also don't have the accountability. And to your point earlier, we don't understand, vulnerability is truly a strength, and vulnerability, it's a risk as well, because it's an invitation for feedback, right? That's really what vulnerability is. It's an invitation to feedback. And I think if we're honest, I'll be honest, I've been afraid of feedback.
Oh, absolutely. Because then if you don't like the response, then it makes you feel really bad. Right?
Absolutely. And I think, and then that becomes shameful, and then that becomes, and then we tuck and hide. and then we just put on the, the masculine face or whatever that is,
Yeah.
Yeah. And one follow-on to that, Purvis, Dave and I find it so interesting that the men who tend to get really good feedback, to your feedback point, tend to be those men who respond to it really effectively.
Absolutely.
They welcome it. And even if they've really gotten it wrong, they show gratitude for that and say, thank you. Wow, I had no idea. They might even be authentic enough to say, that's really painful for me to hear. I had no idea that I was blowing it like that. And this is a little hard for me. Could I come back to you, maybe in a day or so and continue this conversation? Because I know I need to get better. And let me just also thank you for trusting me enough to share that, because I know that wasn't easy. Men who tend to do that are those guys who really have this cluster of confidants around them who trust them enough to continue giving them the feedback.
Absolutely. And they're also on their healing journeys as well.
So are you kind of saying our strengths or what we perceive strengths are sort of routed in insecurity on some level? Like me being machismo or whatever, I'm just like, it's a way to sort of mask something else that I'm not really sure about.
Yeah, it can, because I think, this kind of goes full circle, right? To make myself vulnerable and to really be humble and to accept that, be open to this kind of feedback, you're acknowledging that. I think one of the challenges there is that people feel like they're accepting that risk and the risk of what they're seeing happen around them, especially for more senior people, CEOs, for example, back to the cancel culture, right? I'm going to get canceled if I'm that vulnerable, I'm that open and that honest and humble about this. But I think what we find is that the reality is that it's something different, right? That when men are putting themselves out there, and this is part of who they are as leaders, as people, that we are on that journey, that healing journey, as Purvis was talking about, that people will meet us there. They'll meet us where we are, and they really, I think, appreciate that authenticity.
Absolutely.
So going back to the cancel culture issue, in this environment, leaders really are afraid to make mistakes and saying things wrong. They don't have permission to be honest, even if the intent is there. And that really does affect allyship. And so how do we give them the space to learn and not be perfect, but actually just push the movement forward?
I think as a woman, I would say that if a man has made a mistake or said something accidentally which was sexist or racist or, transphobic, homophobic, whatever it is, but that person did it because of lack of awareness and is genuinely apologetic and is acknowledging responsibility, saying sorry and ready to move on and not repeat the mistake. I think that genuineness does come across, and it's going to really help the person. Of course, if you are resorting to half-hearted cover-ups and making excuses and defending yourself and being dismissive, then that might backfire. That might go in a very wrong direction. But if you are genuine, if you're authentic, if you're vulnerable, people most of the time are able to recognize that, and hopefully you will not be cancelled. But yes, I think, given the environment that we are in, it's difficult to say what can get you into trouble. But again, I would say authenticity, vulnerability, acknowledging responsibility, these are the keys. If you can do that, then hopefully everything is going to be okay. And you will be accepted even for your mistakes, and you will be forgiven.
Absolutely. We all have biases. It's part of being human. Our collective biases can show up in systems that contribute to gender inequalities. How can we become more self-aware and start to interrupt our own biases? Like, what's one action step you guys do to sort of shortcut that decision-making or stop the decision-making shortcut process?
I think in terms of biases, it's important that you kind of speak to people outside of your echo chamber is really important. So social media allows you to build really kind of unhealthy echo chambers of people who just agree with you. And I think, Twitter and kind of even LinkedIn allows you to just kind of connect with people who think the same way as you, and that's really unhealthy in some ways, because you're not being you can avoid people whose opinions you don't like. So I think we all hold biases, and sometimes they're overt, and people are not capable of moving beyond them. Speak to people, listen to what they say. So you can speak to people and kind of switch off, but really kind of listen to what they say, get content from outside of your echo chamber, and understand. I think one of the issues with sort of men's fear of cancelling and that kind of thing is men are not used to being uncomfortable. They're not used to white men are not used to walking into a room and it being full of people who are not the same as them. And even talking about allyship and women's issues online, not everyone's going to agree with you and they're going to come back at you, but you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable if you're going to change anything, because
Absolutely.
If you don't do that, then nothing will change at all, and you can build these kind of walls around yourself. So getting comfortable with being uncomfortable is incredibly important, and that's one of the things that I put on this LinkedIn post was, get into spaces where you are the only person of a certain type. So last year I mentored through a network called Like-Minded Females, a really brilliant mentoring network. And it was mostly women mentoring women. I can't even remember how I came across this network, but they asked me to mentor, and I was a bit like, am I allowed to? Can I do it? Like, is this okay? Anyway, it was okay. And it was a really kind of great experience. So you have to get outside of your echo chamber and read deeply, read different perspectives. And then when you're faced with stuff you're uncertain about, lean into it and not run away. But I think most of the time men run away from those situations. So if I put a post online around intersectional issues, around women's issues, I know that 90% of the people that interact with that are going to be either women or people of color. There'll be no white men that interact with that post because they'll be like, oh, that's not for me. I'm not really interested in that. So, yeah. That's how I think you can confront your own bias.
I love that. Anyone else want to add to that?
I think that if we're talking about gender, just one add-on, I was nodding my head to everything Henry said, but I one subtle thing that I've had to learn slowly, and I've had to kind of work at this, are some of the more subtle forms of sexism that I think we can miss, and especially as men, because we don't receive it as much. So, how about benevolent sexism, right? All of that stuff that sounds chivalrous, it sounds positive, it sounds protective on the surface. Like, hey, we shouldn't consider Hira for that promotion because, she has kids. Well, that sounds positive, right? But no, it's not. I'm making all kinds of assumptions about her. I don't know what she wants, but I should take the time to check with her. Hey, can I put you forward for this? Are you even interested? But too often we default to the benevolent sexism. And I think when people hear it, they don't pick up on the fact that this is one of those death by 1,000 cuts women experience every day. It undermines them, right? It takes away their autonomy. And so it's not just the egregious sexism and bias I need to look for. I need to educate myself, to Henry's point, about some of the more subtle kinds of things. And I see that as being maybe the next step and the next challenge.
Absolutely.
I think one other thing we can do, and I think one of the ways I think about this is how do I put it into action every day, and certainly from my background as a sociologist, I think about the language aspect of it, and certainly we find biased language, right, in lots of different ways. And as you learn that something is biased, is then the hard part there is, it's like, well, how am I going to change that for myself? Because that sounds like a lot of work, and it is, and it's really, just try to, for example, if you always go into a meeting and you refer to large groups of people as just generically guys, which has become so culturally common in lots of different settings, and everybody's like, well, yeah, I didn't mean to privilege the men in the room. I wasn't really referring. I was referring to the women, everybody in the room in that way. It's like, well, but it's not really all that inclusive of language. Could you use a different term, a different way to address people so that everybody felt included? And you're in the way that you did that, you'll find yourself, as you begin to work on that, catching yourself, and you probably will make the mistake of continuing to use the word over and over again, but you'll start to catch yourself, and it almost becomes frustrating in some ways, until you get to the point where it's like, now I'm actually thinking far enough in advance where I'm actually changing it. I'm thinking about it. All right, so I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say this instead. And now I change it. And now that's the first practice, right, in terms of changing behavior in a direction that we're looking for. And it takes time, especially, I think, the older we are, the more time we've spent in one particular culture, around one set of workplace experiences. It's hard to change these behaviors that we've used for a long time.
No, absolutely. I love that. And it's almost kind of where we were going to end this with too. So I think you kind of rolled us right into that. So at Consciously Unbiased, we talk about microprogressions, and they're basically small action steps that you can do to change the culture or an environment within an organization. And so I'd love to hear one small action step that can lead to a big impact over time that men can take to support women at work. And I'll give you an example of a microprogression that I learned early on in when COVID started, was that we were doing these Zoom calls, and I'd always want to get my idea across. So I'd cut people off and talk over them. Right. And what does that do? So if you're a minority, it went and sends a subconscious signal that you're not important to me and your ideas aren't, because I was so busy trying to barf my ideas onto you. And so one small action step I do is now I listen, digest what you're asking for, and then respond to the question you're asking for, rather than pushing something that you don't really care about. So that's an example of microprogression.
Okay.
I like that. That's very good. Active listening, which is what that is, right? Active listening on purpose, and listening to what is said and what is not said. And I think, I try to cultivate that in my CEO clients often, is to listen to what's not being said, listen to the body language, listen to the tone of voice, right? Just being intentional about your leadership, being intentional about listening, because people, believe it or not, people can tell how you're listening to them. So that is a great micro progression.
Love that.
I would add to that and say that I'm a huge fan of surveys and polls. I love to do surveys and polls every now and then to capture experiences of people and find out what exactly it is that they want. So I would say go and talk to women, either through surveys, polls, or have actual conversations rather than assuming what women want and what they don't want. Find out from them what is it that what is it that they want. And once they do share their grievances, or once they do vent out, don't dismiss them, and don't treat bias as a dirty word, except that we are all biased, because if we are dismissing that, we're dismissing science. The brain functionality is designed in such a way that we all have a biases. As a woman, I have biases against other women too. But what we do need to do, there's no button that you can consciously press and stop the bias. You have to actually question yourself all the time and take a step back, because we've grown up with deeply entrenched biases. So I think if we can consciously take a step back and see what is it that we're doing wrong, and question ourselves, what assumptions am I making on the basis of a person's gender, race, ethnicity, faith, or any other protected characteristic? I think that would really help.
I love the way you put that. I've never heard it said that way before, especially about the bias piece and questioning science. I'm going to use that if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I'll keep mine really short. I'm going to hit the sponsorship piece. My micro progression, if you happen to be a male, and you happen to be a male with any seniority, it's not enough to be nice to women and to mentor them that way. You need to talk about talented women when they're not even in the room. Tell other people why they're rock stars, why they should be considered. Tell them about their great performance. This requires more skin in the game and risk on your part, but you need to step up and do that.
Love that.
Right.
And on the note of gender equity starts at home, If you're not sure if you're partnered with a woman, you're not sure if you're doing your fair share and being a great ally at home, go home tonight and do your domestic audit and ask. And when she tells you, here's places you could be stepping up your game, time to go take a macro progression and step it up big time. And then do the same thing at work, right? And when it's your turn to take the kids to the doctor or stay home with the sick kids or something like that, don't slink out the back door quietly, leave loudly. Leave so it normalizes it for everybody, junior men, and for the women, so it's not so stigmatizing for them.
Absolutely.
And I will say something different. So buy from female-owned businesses. So women don't want more mentoring. They don't want more kind of unsolicited advice. They want you to buy from their business if they're a business owner. So buy from female-owned businesses.
Love it. But thank you all so much. It's so enlightening, and we're honored to have you today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fun
Thanks for including
conversation.
us.
You guys are amazing.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Purvis. You too.
Thanks, everyone.